Robin Winogrond is a landscape architect and urban designer in Zurich, Switzerland. She practices internationally on projects, juries, lecturing, teaching, and publishing. Her interdisciplinary background reflects in an array of prize-winning projects, ranges from built urban space, installations and gardens, to concepts for large and small-scale open space. She was resident artist at Stuttgart Academy of Art, held a Master's of Landscape Architecture and Bachelor in Urban Prize Design. רובין, היי. רובין וינוגרונד, אדריכלית נוף ומעצבת אורבנית בציריך, בעלת תואר שני באדריכלות נוף ותואר ראשון בעיצוב עירוני, עוסקת בתכנון פרויקטים בינלאומיים, הרצאות, הוראה ופרסום. הפרויקטים שלה עוסקים בחילוץ הפוטנציאל הפואטי של אתרים עירוניים ופרבריים, הופכים את הזהות והסתירות הטבועות בהם לחוויות עוצמתיות.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor and pleasure to be here, especially in this difficult time. And I just want to say that my heart goes out to all the people suffering in this difficult moment. I will begin with a brief introduction to the ideas that are behind the projects, then I will show a series of projects, and the introduction will explain the title of this project. I would just like to mention the triptych behind. I guess that doesn't work on this, okay? You see the transformation from the left to the right, from the landscape that is able to express itself in its characteristics to increasingly standardized landscapes. And this lecture is about the international problem of the incredibly fast process of standardizing landscapes into becoming very genetic, including our urban landscapes, and the projects that I do mostly on the edge of town, the agglomeration, as we say in Switzerland, the agglo, and my fight to express the site in a very individual way. Yes. Nope, sorry, I'm hitting the wrong, here. Okay. Switzerland is a very small country, and they are just starting to build high-rises, so it's a country where on the land that's flat enough to build on, there's a great amount of sprawl, leading to this very suburban or agglomeration atmosphere. When I was a student, I ran across this quote from Le Corbusier: "The purpose of architecture is to move us." And I thought, that's brilliant, that's amazing, but how shall we do this in urban space and in landscape? Because the architect has a lot of control with the 5 facades of the building to let in light, to exclude views. But in landscape, we have a very difficult time to control the exterior. So how can we have the power to actually make landscapes able to go under our skin? And I will follow this with 3 quotes that describe the experience of the inner experience within us and the experience of a landscape outside of us. And the experience when something goes under our skin means that there's a meeting of the inner and the outer world. Von Humboldt is a German scientist from the 1700s. Many things are named after him, many plants, as we know. And in a recent book about him, the author writes, for a scientist like Humboldt, who was trying to understand nature, the dualism between the external and the internal world, meaning that outside of our body and that in our body, was the most important question. Humans were like citizens of 2 worlds, occupying both. Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer, puts it this way, and I think it's very appropriate to how we design. The taste of the apple lies not in the fruit itself, but rather in the contact of the fruit with the tongue, with the palate. In a similar way, the meaning of poetry lies in the meeting of the poem and the reader. So when I work with my projects, I work very, very strongly with this dialogue between the inner and outer. And lastly, Louis Kahn, the American architect, if you think about it, you realize that you don't say the same thing in a small room and a large room. The large and the small room, the tall and the low room, the room with the fireplace and without, all become great events in our minds. And so when I show you the project, you'll see my attempt to use space, to move space and create it so that it becomes great events in our minds. I've followed the atmospheric discussion. It's a small group of architects still, I believe. Peter Zumthor from Switzerland, Stephen Hall from the United States, Johanni Palasma from Norway. This is Finland, pardon. A very small group of architects who discuss atmosphere quite strongly. And in a recent book by this group, the editor put this photo and made a plea for us planners to put more atmosphere in our projects. And I thought, great, but look at the photo he put with it. He's obviously not a planner, because my building sites and yours probably don't look like this. They look like this. So how can we make the landscapes that look like this go under our skin and become powerful places? And this is this aglo. It's a very disrespectful term in Switzerland, meaning this generic standardized landscapes that we live in. This is a photo I took on the edge of town of Zurich, and you see that it's a highway and a train going above your heads, a bicycle path, footpath going below, and you see that the river is in a concrete bed, something you know well as well. What I like so much about this photo is the power of the voice of nature. The water, no matter where it is, has the ability through its reflections, through its properties of taking in light and of motion, to have a very, very strong voice of its own. And vegetation the same. It's coming up through every crack it can, and you feel the vibrancy. And these are things that are able to go under our skin. I ran across this book while I was doing a competition, a fabulous competition for an expo, which we were able to win. And it's a British sociogeographer, and he uses this expression, geographical re-enchantment, just on some page in the book. But the expression caught my imagination, because I thought, maybe this is what I've been looking for these many years since I was a student. It's a way of describing how landscape has the ability to enchant us. And I say re-enchantment, not enchantment, because of this suburban context where the soul has mostly been taken out, or these generic landscapes where the soul has been taken out. And how can we culturally understand the great significance of what it means to have landscapes speak to us, including the urban landscape, to touch us, and what this means to me. So in the framework of this expo competition, I created a kind of a cosmological understanding based on a landscape theoretician in the United States, John Dixon Hunt. Maybe some of you know him. And he describes the three natures, saying that the first nature is the natural, the untouched by human beings. And I describe this as the power of this raw nature, the wilderness, the geomorphology, stone, water, wood, all these incredibly powerful materials, which you'll see how I attempt to use them. The cultural landscape, how humans change and use the landscape as a resource. And his third nature, the top, is gardens, because it's landscape just for enjoyment, not for function. I decided to put that in the cultural landscape because I think we sorely, sorely need to talk about the dialogue between the human being and the landscape, and I added a third nature, and that is the one of imagination. It's the personal sphere, it's intellectual, it's emotional, it's informed by memory, by longing, by experience. And if we don't go into that, we will have the risk of making very standard landscapes that are not able to be catalysts of our imagination. And I believe this to be so important. I think it's equal with all the ecological needs, all the needs of inclusion, all the topics that are very urgent at the moment. And I believe this, our contributions to stopping the generification, that's not a word, but the generification maybe, of our landscapes is a very critical task we have today. So in my own words, In Search of Geographical Re-enchantment is not about nostalgia, prettiness, or being emotional. It is the search, using projects as concrete testing grounds, to suss out the poetic potential of a site with the ability to fascinate, engage, defy expectations. It aspires to create memorable and specific places which serve as catalysts of our imagination. So before I go into the first project, I would just like to say that one of the things you'll see in the projects is my attempt to escape the kinds of language, or let's say ask the question, how do we find the design language when we design? How do we choose how we're going to approach a project? And people have often said, you don't have a style, and I think, my goodness, no, that's the last thing I need is a style. What I need is to let the site speak. And in order to do that, I try to avoid existing languages and try to create a unique language for each site that I design. I'll begin, just to go back, I will begin with a Museum of Natural History I designed for Eastern Switzerland, and the working title is Natural History on a Highway Tunnel. This is the cow pasture that the site is on. It's very small. Behind us is a new museum. You'll see it in a moment. And in front, the backside of a cathedral. It's in the, so I don't have an ability to point, is that correct? There's no pointer in this system? No, not, okay. What you see are a few characteristics I'd just like to talk about. This is again on the edge of town. You have a loud, very loud road passing by, single family, multifamily housing, sports, all the things around it. And you see the very small site between the two buildings. And I asked myself, how shall I have people be absorbed or immersed in the amazing story of natural history when they're on top of a highway tunnel, first of all, a completely artificial site, and surrounded by this suburban setting. So I used 2 or 3 different design measures, I would say, to try to increase this ability to be immersed. The first, you see some, I'm sorry, I'm used to having a pointer, this is a bit tricky. On the southern edge of the park, a bit of residual vegetation, and I decided to frame the site with vegetation so that people wouldn't be distracted. You'll see in most of the projects, I invite this rather disastrous suburban environment to join the project, but in this case I blocked it out so people could immerse themselves. The second measure I did was to cover the entire park with a natural stone so that there are not paths. You can walk anywhere you want and you trip across clues of nature, which I'll show you in a moment. And the third thing are what you see, these giant stepping stones. And what I discovered is the stepping stones is a very ancient tool used in gardens from thousands of years ago, Japan or wherever. And the reason they're so effective, I have to walk away, is because the moment we have to watch where our feet go, our attention goes into our bodies, and this is embodied experience. So I blew up the normal stepping stones of 30 centimeters to about 5 to 7 meters in size, so that you're stepping like in German there's a nice verb to tiger through a space, and you're discovering these clues. So these are the 3 languages I use. This is the plan. And here you see, just after planting, it's quite young, the use of these stepping stones, which then become carriers of information about natural history. This is a quote from Darwin on a 7-meter large stepping stone. Each letter is about 30 centimeters, so you're walking on the messaging you're getting. And it says, nothing in life is as constant as change. And I thought, this sums up natural history probably as well as anyone could. The stepping stones become an element of play for children. They run all over the place and discover all kinds of things. Here is I'll just mention a few of the riddles. I used riddles of nature, I call them, in this park. The stone you see on the right side, this is the stone I was able to get in a quarry. It's a beautiful green limestone. And it was just the refuse. I could get it for almost free. And I covered the entire park in it so that you're walking gingerly on these 2 big stones and you're very much involved in your body and moving through this vegetation. But next to it, I took along sort of broken relics of culture, because all the cultural buildings of Eastern Switzerland are built from this beautiful material. So I wanted to show the dialogue between culture and nature with these 2 materials. Here you see the construction of the concrete pavers. And what's so fascinating about it is I learned that concrete is nothing more than the human version of the most prominent stone in Eastern Switzerland, which is a conglomerate called Nagelfluh. And what happens is if you hammer concrete, it looks identical to the natural stone of the region. So I again made a play of culture and nature, and I used slats to form the concrete. I used drain mats to press into the concrete and hammered it so that you have it both in the natural and the cultural form, and you start to express what what this ground material can do. I spoke with many of the experts from the museum, and there was one working with fossils, and I learned that eastern Switzerland had been a tropical ocean at one point. So none of us know that, actually, not even the Swiss probably. And so I took all the animals and plants that were present in these different eras of the natural history for many years and embedded them within the stepping stones. These are dinosaurs, they're not dinosaurs, but saurian, that's a little bit different. Giant meter-long thighs and eyes, 30-centimeter giant eyeballs, etc. And they're all embedded in these stones. That's the head of one. That's again that quote. And other information taken from natural history. So the idea is not to make a linear, like put up signs and say, I'm going to explain to you the natural history, but to have you trip across clues that make you curious. And they're very, very funny words taken from the literature of the museum, Arctic, Alpine, and supercontinent, and metamorphosis, and they all have deep meanings. This is the patina that begins to form after the first this is about 2 years after the park was built. And there's a very nice story about the 3 eras, but I won't go into it. But I did select 3 of the most important eras of the geography, and I used it as part of the narrative, which you can read in the stones that roll down from the different places in the glacier time and so on and so forth. Here you see the woods that I planted just filling in, and I put in hydrangea, which is an exotic in northern Switzerland. And I was raked over the coals in the press for being a hater of nature because I took a non-native. And as we know with the climate change, now we're forced to take the exotic plants from the south because the ones that are native are dying from the heat. So it's quite a kind of a paradox, I would say. Just some last images of how this is, the site is. And the qualities I tried to invest in this park so that one can get lost in a sort of a magic of the site, of the history, of nature. These are swamp cypresses, and they used to grow on the site, so the director was very excited. So it's an attempt to weave many, many stories into a site that allows you to discover things by yourself, but the museum then can use as a pedagogic tool, because the museum then can go through and tell many, many stories about the different plants I used, the different materials I used, the games and riddles of nature and of that specific site. The next project is the new airport of Zurich. It was a competition I was able to win for and with my last office, which I co-founded, Studio Vulcan. And this is called Natural Preservation Meets Shopping Mall. The site of the park, excuse me, is my English okay or is it too fast? Okay. The site of the park is this small green hill circle surrounded by highways and the airport. This was an international competition. What you see here is the park, the competition model, in fact, and an 8-story high new building across the road from the airport, which is a new shopping mall, multi-complex, conference center, 2 hotels, headquarters, all kinds of things, offices, hospitals. And the idea was to take this fragment. I just want to go back one more. What you see is, this is a very fragment of landscape, and I'll explain that story in a moment. Here you see the new multi-complex on the right. Needless to say, today those buildings are failing, just got built. And on the left you see the airport, and on the right you see the park sticking its head up above. It's a hill. The whole park is one hill. When I first went to the site, all the teams that were invited, Topatec and all these international teams, Vogt and so on, we all went to the site, and I thought, wow, you see the 2nd and 4th pictures I took on the site and that walk. All the teams take a walk. And I thought, wow, these are 2 Swiss historic paintings, the 1st and the 3rd. And sometimes the site is bucolic and it looks like a Swiss painting, but mostly it looks like this. So again, the challenge, how to make a park able to speak to us about its site, its bizarre site, which I'll go into in a moment, and go under our skin. This is a photo I particularly like, I just took on my iPhone. What you have here is the clashing of these cultures on this site, which I chose to bring to expression. you have the parking lot, the parking garage for the airport, and you have artificially planted wetlands, woodlands, and fields, ecological fields, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. And they're all stuffed together in the imagery of the site. I find these frictions and paradoxes of the contemporary landscape fascinating, and I don't try to push them out and make everything pretty and sweet, but to say, how can we experience our contemporary landscape in a poetic way? So we began with this ecological cartography because the site was isolated for so many years that it has a very, very high ecological value. There were so many laws on the site, there are so many laws, we were barely able to do anything with the site. So the first thing I said is, well, let's reconfigure that, and you see on the right picture, no, sorry, I'll go into this in just a moment. I think I'll do it another way. There are two main concepts I put behind the project, which luckily we were able to win. And the first was I began to study the historic maps of the area, and I saw that it used to be a glacier moraine, which means it was a hill. And in the 50s came the airport, in the 70s came the highway to go to the airport, and they took the excavation from the new highway and plopped it on top of the glacier moraine. So you have the natural ground, and then you have this completely mixed up, crazy, bad soil, the way that you have under a highway, thrown on top. And then it was placed under natural preservation and no one could get there, so it became this ecologically very high place. To compensate for the highway, they were asked to plant ecological zones, which is how the artificial woodlands and wetlands and everything got there. That's the first thing I did, was decide I'd like to tell that story of the vertical layering of the site. And I'll show that to you in a moment. The second conceptual building block that I used was, you see the red circle, that's about 200 meters in diameter. And the name of the building to the left, the new complex, is The Circle. And the site is a circle, and the site is a hill. So I felt that using this giant circle would be an entire series of storytellings at a level that every human being who goes there, from Uruguay to Russia to wherever, China, could all understand. When you fly over the site, you see the circle. It describes the morphology of the hill, and it separates two zones, or it articulates two zones that were there. I mean, the woodlands on the edge, and the center, which basically has very few trees. So these are the two building blocks of the project. For the vertical layering, I said the following. I want people to sense the glacier moraine, the archaic Swiss glacier moraine. And I want them to sense the woodland ring, which is artificially planted on that. And then the topography that you see is not a landscape architect, even me probably, would come and make a hill. But the engineers just threw all that excavation, so you have these fabulously bizarre shapes. It's like a sculpture, a landscape sculpture. So I wanted the people to move up the vertical layers of the hill and experience this topographical sculpture of engineering products. And then I said, you know, the sky, we don't really talk about the sky, except for my last colleague with the drones, who was very threatening to my idea of the sky. But it's an airport, and I want the people to climb up, and I want the sky to be a space you can feel. So I had two possible ways to do that, and I'll show you how I articulated these 4 layers, including the sky. The first one is a funicular that goes up the site, because we have to get the handicap up there. This is a visualization for the competition. I wanted it to be this raw, to feel this archaic glacier moraine. The airport authorities were very fancy, and they said, no, it has to be very proper. So you'll see. And then I wanted to articulate the woods as this magical place of forest, even though it's planted and scraggly and young and ugly, and it's maintained by foresters and so on. But I wanted to try to invest it with a kind of a magical sense of what that is. And then I used the topography. For example, this is a pavilion I'll show you that actually is in the woodland ring. So I tried to make it an expression of the experience of the forest, which I'll show you in a moment. And I had it do something else. I had the pavilion floor walk up the hill. And I used that ability to express the topography as a social moment to say, how many things could this pavilion do at a social level? And I'll show you all of this in just a moment. So, and then when we got to the sky in this visualization, I said, gee, I don't know what's better. Should I make this? I made something called the sky platform. And it's at the top, it's 30 meters wide, and the water surface is 17 meters wide. And I said, I want it to be this sort of kitschy, but Instagram moment where you are at New Year's Eve and you're at the top of this hill and you're looking out at the Alps, and it's this amazing sense of power of the landscape. And I don't know if it's better to make a reflective surface, so you see the sky reflected under your feet, or to use steam to make the space above in the sky, which is usually a void, into a physical space we can sense with our bodies. It turned out both were possible, and we were able to do it. So I'll now go through a series of photos of the built project. Everything's still quite young, of course. It's just built 2 years ago. These are 12-meter-high beech trees that form the 200-meter circle at the scale of landscape, the scale of infrastructure, the scale of the suburbs. We were, after 1.5 years of negotiations with forestry specialists and politicians, we were allowed to take out some of the woods so that you could have a real physical experience moving through it. We took a woodland expert from Denmark. Maybe some of you know him. He does the Waldlabor, or Woodland Laboratory in Denmark. Anders Busse Nielsen. And this was a huge effort in ecological sense to say the woods can be an experience and not this scraggly jungle that it is at the moment. Then this is the pavilion under construction, a very high intervention in the woodland circle. It was illegal to put any concrete foundations, do anything, except in this point we had very, very many constraints. So the idea was to put very concrete interventions into the space. Here is the pavilion. This is one from a series of about 8 sketches I did where I studied how you could use this. For example, having the steps walk up the hill. You make a stage and a staging. You can have concerts, you can have lectures, the people in the hotels, the conference centers, they can have yoga classes and readings and films and fancy champagne parties, but you're sitting in the woods in this very simple structure. And that structure can be good when you're 1 person, when you're 10 people, when you're 100 people, and when you're 200 people. So the idea, excuse me, was to make this very powerful architectural moment that melts into the woods. And what I did, let me see if I have a picture. If not, I'll just tell you briefly. I didn't explain it, but in the model you saw, I exploded the roof so that it's always framing the sky, so that the sky becomes an issue. And you're seeing here, the plants have been removed because they had to look for mines before we could build the plant. This used to be a magical zone, and now the plants are coming back. So it's actually sitting in a small grove of trees. I made another thing, which I'll show you in a moment, called a fire ring. The original is 10 meters in dimension. This is a bit of a smaller version. And you see how scraggly these woods are. And I decided to make a place where all people, strangers, could meet. Swiss never meet. I'll explain it when I explain the project. They never meet the strangers. They always sit in their little groups. And I said, no, I want to make an American cowboy ring, and all the people can come, and Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and school classrooms, and they feel like they're disappearing into the woods, although the whole thing is so tiny you can see almost out of the edges. But I can get them to be immersed in this woods by making a place they can grill, which is very important in Switzerland. Everyone grills all the time, sausages. So I made this space where people could feel they're having a woodland experience despite the very small size. Another measure I did is I said, what would I do if I had a lunch break and I worked there and there's 10,000 visitors a day? I said, Matt, I'd like to make some yoga mats. You go up there, you lie down, you look up at the trees, you do some yoga, you read a book, you have a break from your work routine from this very busy airport. And so I created the yoga mats and put them also in the woodland intervention ring. Now we're moving up the hill. This is the strange topography, which the builders always wanted to take away, make it better. I said, no, 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 stop. That's part of the storytelling. This is the excavation put in these strange forms. These are chairs that I took from the Adirondack chair in upstate New York from 1903, a famous design. Maybe you have it here in Israel now. It's just sort of spreading in the world. It's an old wooden chair, and you lean back and you enjoy the landscape of upstate New York. So I said, let's make a contemporary version of this chair, and people can carry these chairs all over the park. They weigh a lot, but they're very beautiful. Furniture designers did that with us. And this chair, people took it to look at the aglo, to look at the suburbs, like that's the view. hey, you know, let's appreciate it. Now we're at the top, at the sky platform. This looks quite small, it's actually quite big, and this is when it's a reflective moment, reflecting the sky. And in about a 15-minute cycle, that water actually goes down and becomes fog. The steam comes up. And I took this with my iPhone. On a day that's not windy, you get lost in the fog. And getting lost in a built environment is very, very special, and I think a very wonderful experience. And I took the steam because it reflects the weather. So every time the weather changes, you have this experience of weather on the sky platform. The next project I'm going to show was also a two-phase international competition in Germany, invited competition that very luckily we were able to win. I designed it for my last office, the office I left, my office. And it's in Heidelberg. This is a former Nazi military base. And the competition brief was to take all the leftover fragments of the military base and turn it into a contemporary park for the neighborhood because the city's expanding. This is how the site looked when I got there for this walk that all the teams take. It was overgrown, it was sort of falling apart, and this is the Nazi facade with oversized soldiers guarding the entrance plaza. After the Nazis were there, the American military took over and called it Campbell Barracks, and NATO headquarters for Europe came to the site. From the other side, the parade grounds, the vegetation as I found it, but unfortunately it got cleaned up and corrected, and the oddity of place got lost. So the concept that I invented was to say, let's make all the elements of power, the artifacts that were left on site, there were a lot of stuff left on site, and the spaces of military control and power, and turn them into elements and spaces of social encounter. And these are three different ways to do it. The first one I read here, social encounter, historical encounter, and contextual encounter. And that builds the basis of the park. And what I'd like to talk about today is only the historical encountering, where I took a series of elements and recoded them into a new language of encounters. And I'll just go mention two examples. The oak tree is an ancient symbol of power. The Nazis took it over and used it for their own symbol. I made it the main species of the park and, so to say, gifted it back to the German society. The eagle, same story, and there's a lot of these different examples, you'll see. Oops. So here are many of the artifacts that were left on site. The NS eagles, which are still on site. The city said, Robin, do you want to take those away? And I said, no, that's part of the storytelling of the site. But the swastika is gone. The control cabins of the Americans at the checkpoint, I'll show you in a moment. The leftover furniture from the Americans, they left it there, the 1970s furniture. Very charming, these lamps are everywhere, these strange 1970s lamps. And every team got a little brochure with all these artifacts. We were 27 teams in the first round, and no one touched the history. But I had lived in southern Germany, I understood it, I'm Jewish, and I'm American, and I think my brain was just like, memory lane, let's make this a memory lane, let's talk about the history. Of course, all the other teams avoided the history. These are the surveillance cameras, which I use. I'll show you in a moment how I use it. Here's a plan of the site. You see there's, I can't point to you, but you'll see where there's an orange circle at the bottom. Those are parade grounds. The orange circle you're looking at is 90 meters in diameter. The original was 100 meters in diameter. It's empty space. To the left, the riding grounds where the horses were trained. To the north, a park where the Nazi military elite could dine and stroll. And so I felt that all this had to remain the main sense of each site, was its military historical sense. But I would tuck into that as many social encounter elements as possible. So it becomes a contemporary park, but it remains this military site. So here you see falsified, quite compact, this 90-centimeter circle, surrounded by trees and green for people to have picnics and to spend time. And in the center, this very large space, which I renamed from the parade grounds to the forum, meaning a place of discourse, of freedom of speech, the former park where the elite could stroll. I put in very tiny interventions for appropriation by the people. There are researchers, a museum, schools, and all the people can go in the park, but it maintains its character. The former riding grounds, called coded as a cultural market for many events and alternative uses. And here we'll go through a few photos of the site as it's been constructed. This won the Landesdien Prize for Public Space. Also the airport park won the Landesdien Prize for Public Space. This was an honorable mention last year, I believe. And you see the park and the parade grounds. The vegetation's young. There's a very nice measure we did called the red band, which unifies all the fragments of the park and these various identities. Otherwise, you don't know you're in a park. So this red band actually takes all the pavings from the NS who were there, the Nazi military, the American military, the NATO, and it crushes up all these different pavements and pours them together into a paving. These were the samples. So when you walk on it, you're walking on the history, on the real history. And here you see the red band. Of course, in the schemes, it was 4 or 5 meters wide. In reality, the cost so much, we only had 80 centimeters. But this is the red band, which surrounds all the spaces. Here's the red asphalt that takes up the rest of the space, moving through the site. The emptiness, the sheer emptiness of this site. This is taken in winter, no vegetation, and the benches that I put around it. But you can sense that the size, I walked it again and again, and I said, I want to leave it big enough to be creepy, to be eerie, because that's when landscape goes under our skin. That's when it moves us, is when it does something. So it's just a bit too big. You actually want to get out of there and you can't, and you start to realize its historical use. But it has this wonderful fountain, which is incredibly popular, used by kids. In the park, I put in little things I called them living rooms, little interventions of pavement. The historic paving on the site was used for these small spaces to meet and to stay. Here's something I call the lounge. I put it in front of one of the barracks, which will become student housing, and collected all these crazy 1970s lamps and furniture from the Americans and stuffed it in there so that the students have a kind of lounge, and it becomes a place where all the people passing by hang out and sit and can encounter each other, the very different kind of people. Here it is just after construction. And the checkpoint I took it for a playground. I was fascinated. If you see the two roofs at the top, and if you look closely, you'll see the paving with all the radii where the trucks and cars had to go around and be checked in all these checkpoint cabins. And I said, okay, this park needs a big playground. I'm going to take these radii and have them spin out and make a play world. And this world is going to have very different kinds of play worlds. I call them Spielwelten in German. Very different kinds of places to play in. Here you see the recoding of the artifacts using a sepia color. All of the artifacts are painted sepia color. You just saw it in the lamps. It's something between rust and memory and fading and an old photo, something like that. And those became a play space under the roof. This is called the hiding world, Versteckwelt. And it's, the plants have just been planted, so they become quite big, and the kids run around in this labyrinth. This is called Chill Lounge. The high school, in the participation, the high school kids said they'd like to have a place to chill. So I made this about 30-meter rubber sculpture where they could ride bikes and lie down and chat and smoke and kiss and all that kind of stuff. It's a stage with staging. Elderly children can make performances, have workshops, do all kinds of things. And the last slide I'd like to show for this park is a new layer put on. I was fascinated by this furniture from the 1970s that I saw in Rio de Janeiro and San Francisco. And I said this could make a landscape for seating, which can be kind of a landscape of encountering. And this seating accompanies the red band. And it's a way to make an informal kind of meeting point that travels along throughout the park. As part of this project, the budget ran out. I had proposed to have the entrance plaza where these Nazi eagles are. I showed you the facade you see on the left with the big soldiers. I wanted to make an installation there, a special one. There was no more money, so we went and got sponsors. And I ended up doing a sound installation there. And what you're looking at is the history of the site to the upper right, the war period, where you have, I collected all the surveillance cameras and large lighting masts, stuffed them in there. They're painted also the sepia color. And there are loudspeakers that have original sound fragments of all the history from 1937 to 2013. And they're structured in 4 platforms. Upper right is the war, upper left Cold War, post-war, lower left Cold War, and lower right post-Cold War. And it's military and everyday sounds, because the soldiers who are working in the barracks, they go home and turn on the radio and they're listening to music and all these things. So it's actually almost 3 hours of sound fragments, everything from Lily Marlene, Nuremberg trials, Hitler declaring the hour 0 of the new calculation time when there's going to be a new Aryan world, Bob Dylan, every possible thing's in there. Television, the nightly news, which is a very big thing in Germany, reporting on the communist bombings which happened on this site, the protest movements. And what I found fascinating is when you go through the 4 eras, you go from a dictatorship to an authoritarian military occupation that's non-dictatorial, to the Cold War, which starts to raise a lot of questions, reflections, Günter Grass, a lot of people discussing and resisting and protesting, to the post-Cold War, which is a time of individualism. And it's very interesting to have acoustic portraits of the 4 periods. I actually sent a sound track of 1 minute, which I'd love to play, but I think we didn't get it in here, unfortunately. So this is the entrance plaza. Left and right, you see it's still a construction site. The project's very new. It just opened last autumn. These are the soldiers. These are the main protagonists, let's say, from the wartime. The eagles we already met. The surveillance cameras that I gathered, the signs which I found in the cellar in English and German. It's very funny, like parking for vacuum cleaner only, very funny things. I stuffed it all together, and I like this mumble jumble of all these elements that let you know that history is not just linear, but one thing leads to another. So you're seeing the soldiers, the control cabin, the names, the signs, and you're seeing the loudspeakers, and you're seeing birds' nests, which I'll show you in a moment. This I already discussed. Here you see this durcheinander. It's kind of a juxtaposition, a kind of a mess. And I like that mess because it challenges our perception and lets us think for ourselves. The people walking, listening. Oh, sorry, that was in fact the last one. Yes, I'm sorry you can't hear it, but what you would have heard is an extreme contrast of sounds between, let's say, Hitler yelling at you and then German songs that are translated with subtitles, where they're trying to be happy and saying, we won't let this war make us bitter, we won't let it destroy our lives, we'll continue to be happy. And then you hear reports from the concentration camps, and then you hear, you know, and it just goes back and forth, and you hear all this different kind of music and reporting and so on. So it really takes you for an emotional ride going through these masks with the sound. The next projects are much smaller and easier to explain. This one is called Wildwood Plaza. It's a project I did in 2013 before my former office. I was asked by a community to do something in the woods. I said, like what? And they said, like, anything you want. I said, cool, great task. So I walked. They said, but could you start with this little woodland fragment, a little hill, and the neighbors would like to have a new path going through it. So I walked through this site, and I found the most extraordinary experience. I had to move through it. It was like a jungle. And I had to move through it, and I found that there were 3 completely different forest imageries and experiences just a stone's throw apart from each other. And I found that absolutely fascinating, and I used it as the backbone of the project. In addition, I began an exploration which today is still ongoing. I'm quite involved in the urban forestry discussions. And there are 2 experiences that I had with the woods, or even more, but I'll mention just the 2 most profound ones I had. And one is that what makes woods so special for the human experience is that there's no front, no back, and no left, and no right. So we're set into a completely unusual sense of our bodies in space. We have a sense of disorientation. We lose our sense of spatial knowledge. We fall into a state of drifting, and that's what makes the experience so powerful. And the other thing that's so curious about forests is that they're occupied, they're filled, but we can still move through them. So we have a sense of discovery in each step we take because we're moving through an occupied space and we're confronted with imagery on highly different levels. This is a little bit of a tricky quote, but it's a very beautiful one. I'd like to just summarize it. John Fowles is a British writer, and he wrote a little book called The Tree, a little paperback. It's about his experience of trees and forests. And he says, nowhere but in the woods are the two great contemporary modes of reproducing reality, the word and the camera. So he's saying the two most common ways of how we document the world around us is writing and photographing. So nowhere are the two most the contemporary modes more at a loss than in the woods. Writing and camera defeat, the woods defeats the camera, drawing paper, the painting canvas. You can't frame them. Words are just as futile and hopelessly too laborious to capture this reality. So the woods have something that we cannot grasp, and that is their beauty and their power. Here you see the site plan of the small fragment, again on the edge of town, again in these sort of suburban generic settings. You see the three clearings I made. They're cut as a circle in the woods, and the circular form is about the sense of no front, no back, no left, no right. You have no sense of spatial orientation, and it is not pre-read for you. And each of these has a completely different forest imagery, and you see the new path going through and then the paths on the side. So the first site here on the left has large beeches that are still very large and stately. And I asked the foresters, why are these three forests so different? And they said, it's the giant storms that swept through Europe. On the protected side of the hill, you have the large beeches that stayed. They're very old. On the non-protected side, the storms raised the woods. So you have the beech tree again, but as a pioneer species making a jungle. And on the third side of the hill, you have these shallow-rooted trees that were tossed around in the sort of apocalyptic landscape. So I said, wonderful, that is my concept. Just to have three plazas where the people can sit and experience these three different worlds, or to sit and watch the woods grow, as someone said. And so the other thing I said is, I don't want to compete with the forest. It's not my job to put in catalog benches and grill spaces and railings and messages with information to read, because that's what keeps you in your head. It's my task to let everyone melt into this forest experience. So everything I did simply took the materials of the forest, recomposed them into a recreational space, and let the voice of the forest itself speak. So here you're looking at the paving and the seating. This is the first circle with the stately beeches. This is the second clearing with the jungle, pioneer vegetation, patina getting older, snow. The apocalyptic third circle with this vegetation trying to survive and growing. And here's with the new installation thrown around. And what's very interesting about this project is, in the ecological sense, this maintained sort of scrappy young forest, just like at the airport park, actually has a certain limitation in its biodiversity, although it certainly had biodiversity. What's beautiful is the wood actually creates moss, and the moss, let me see if I put the pictures in, I don't think I did. Well, I'll move on to another, let's say this picture, the patina. So I'm paid to make a space, I make a space, and immediately that space starts to go into the process of decay. And the moss that grows between the pavers has a very high ecological value. The decaying wood has a very high ecological value. And as the project continues to disappear, so to speak, the biodiversity goes up. So I find it a very interesting play. So the city got a prize for that project, and came back to me many years later, a couple of years ago, and said, could you make another project? And I said, like what? And they said, well, to get another prize. Okay. I'm happy to say I succeeded in that as well. It did just get Yes, a prize also at Lila, or honorable mention, I don't remember something. And it's called the Fire Ring. And I'd like to begin talking about fire as a medium. Again, if you go back to my 3 layers of nature, these are the layer of nature, the power of the voice of water, which you saw in the Circle Park, of forest, which you saw in the past project, and fire, of course, the archaic elements. Gaston Bachelard is a French philosopher, was a French philosopher who wrote The Poetics of Space, maybe some of you know. He also wrote The Psychoanalysis of Fire. And he was very much a phenomenologist, and my work is basically based in phenomenology, which is the philosophy of experience, of perception. And he made this stunning statement about fire. I don't remember if he calls it, or I call it the imagination of matter. I think that's from me, the imagination of matter. Imagination is imbued with poetic experience that transcends the individual imagination. And I think that's an incredibly powerful statement. How can imagination transcend our individual imagination? He says, I'm going to examine a problem in which objectivity has never held sway. It means objectivity never was worth anything. Where the initial seduction of fire is so compelling that it deforms the most rational minds, where daydreams replace thought. This is the psychological problem presented by fire. So he's basically saying we're so seduced by it that our biggest attempts to be rational have no chance. And I found that very powerful. So I decided to make a public space that could be a bonfire in-built space, which is very rare, or actually I don't know another example of it. And I built it in relation to the other one on a glacial site nearby, but at the lake, which means the glacier was the glacier melt of the Alps, formed the Alps, made these small glacier moraines, and then melted down to make these lakes. So it's territorially related to each other. And what I said, so I'm looking for, sorry, I took out a very important slide. To the right of this, about 60, 70 meters away, are a whole series of little grilling tables. And this is really a national sport for the Swiss. To grill a sausage is the most fantastic thing you can do. And you do it only with friends and your closest and family. You always stay in your cliques. There's not a need to chat with anyone, to be curious about anything. It's like very, very personal sphere. So this is the original fire ring that I then copied at the airport. And I said, I'm going to make this cowboy fire ring, because a cowboy fire ring, I was never a cowboy, but I always thought, everyone comes by with their guitar and their sausage and their beer, like, yeah, come on, let's share, you want one of mine? And I thought, maybe the Swiss could enjoy that too. We'll see. So I said, I'm taking the same material as the Wildwood Plaza, its sister project, and using it in a different way, and I'm going to make a social space of encounter, a magnet that allows the bonfire experiencing fire and water next to each other and turn it into this social space. And these are the tree stems that I cut, and you'll see the little stools that are next to it. And the goal was to create an entire series of social encounter possibilities. So the stools become something you can sit down on informally. You can put your laptop, put your wine, put your child, whatever. You can play with these different spaces and form very small groups. Here you see that happening. And I used the project to express the power of the voice of the wood itself. So you see this is a Robinia tsurokatia in English. Oh, forgot my English. You see the profile of this wonderful Robinia tree. And the expression of this wood and how it creates these various experiences. The expression of the tree trunk itself, where I left I didn't have it sawed, I left that. What I did when I went to the foresters to get the wood, there was wood lying around with this surface on it, and I went to the main forester and I said, wow, that's a beautiful surface. It expresses the wood so beautifully. How do you make that happen? He said, that's when the employees do a really sloppy job. I said, I'll take it. So super schön in German means very beautiful. So when I told the people constructing the site, I said, I love this surface and this is what we're going to use. I said, it's super schön, it's really beautiful. And he wrote down, okay, super schön. So he told all his employees, make that happen, And the result is that you have this very strong hard wood, and has something very soft like being on a sofa, but it has a rawness to it which you need to express it. And it's beautiful for the bathers, for the contact with the body, because it's neutral in temperature. So it's not cold in the winter or hot in the summer, and it becomes this fabulous sofa. An unexpected effect of the project is that I put the stones around the fire so that the ashes could easily be swept back into the fireplace. And what happens is the stones warm up. So when the evening comes and it becomes cold, the kids go down in their bikinis and they hang out like with floor heating, and they, you know, lie around on this floor. And I thought that was just really beautiful, because it's again experiencing the change in time as it goes by. So here's a fire. I never caught the moment of the biggest fires, but here it is being used at sunset and at night. And I think I have one last one. And what's really beautiful is, and I'm just going to wrap up with the last very tiny project. What was really beautiful is I went one day to take some pictures, and there were a bunch of young people hanging out, and I said, oh, do you mind if I take some pictures? I designed this. And they said, wow, that's amazing. I said, why is that? They said, it's our favorite place to go. We're here every day, every night. And I said, why is that? And they said, because you can be in your group, in your clique, like Swiss is really important. You can be in your clique, but you're with all these other people and you feel part of a community. And I said, got it. Thank you. And I'm going to wrap up with a project that was actually, I won from my former office 10 years ago. It was put on ice for 10 years, and I'm just in the process of waking it up, and I'm not waking it up. It's come now. It should be constructed soon. We're having terrible problems, which I can briefly explain. But it was a competition for artists and architects to make a sound barrier wall. There's a new law that came up in Switzerland where when a large, loud road, like the entrance to the city, this is the western entrance to Zurich, passes a residential area, the authorities, the highway authorities, are asked to make a sound barrier wall. And we were allowed, all the teams who entered were, it was also 2 phases, were allowed to put in a filling for 4.5 meter high, 1 kilometer long wall with concrete frames, and we could fill it with glass or metal. I had done my master's thesis on water and light, and I had used etched glass and dichroic glass and different things that capture the movement and changes minute by minute of water and light. So I thought, okay, I'm going to try to take out that etched glass and see what happens. This is the site, again, just as banal as all the other sites. Okay, just reading here, 5 minutes more. And how do you make poetics of infrastructure on such a site? It's an infrastructural project. It's the funniest site I ever had. It's 50 centimeters wide and kilometer long, so it's quite a funny park, let's say, or something. And here is a sketch where I tried to study the surroundings of the street, analyze what would be seen through this etched glass or reflected onto the etched glass. And it turned out that the etched glass was a very effective material because it blurs reality. It means, there's a very nice word in German, verfremden. It estranges our everyday urban environment and turns it into new imagery that allows us to experience it in a new way. So here you see a sunrise. We were there in the one, yes. And here's some of the various images that we used to sell this in the competition. After the competition, I studied intensely with specialists and chose 6 degrees of etching, like studied it driving up and down the street to see how it estranged our daily landscape. And there were very, very beautiful poetic images that took place. Here you see, like as a film series, all the different things. And I'll go through a few images and then the lecture's finished. John Cage, who I hope many of you know, a contemporary composer who thought that the sounds of the everyday environment were music. And that's the approach I took to the project. He says, there's no such thing as an empty space or an empty time. There's always something to see, something to hear. In fact, try as we may to make a silence, we cannot. And this silence, almost anywhere in the world today, is traffic. If you listen to Beethoven, it's always the same. But if you listen to traffic, it's always different. So I tried to catch these moment for moment changes in daylight, artificial light, movement, traffic, etc., and turn them into a real-time painting, you could say. This is a landscape hill behind the glass, autumn, office building as evening falls. traffic, sunset, artificial and natural light together, traffic again, traffic with vegetation in front of it, and I will end with that. Thank you very much.